She arrived in France as a 14-year-old orphan from Florence, small and round-faced, with the distinctive bulging Medici eyes that the French court whispered made her look like a fish pulled from the Seine. She spoke with an Italian accent in a court that despised foreigners with a particular, almost theatrical Parisian intensity. She brought with her Florentine cooks, Florentine perfumers, Florentine dressmakers, and, as enemies would later claim with enormous satisfaction, Florentine poisons tucked into the hidden compartments of her traveling chests. Her name was Catherine de' Medici, and for nearly 60 years she would survive everything that France and fate could throw at her. She would outlive her husband. She would outlive 4 of her 10 children. She would outlive the political enemies who plotted her removal, the religious zealots who blamed her for massacres, the courtiers who sneered at her origins, and the Protestant pamphleteers who painted her as a witch in ink-black woodcuts distributed across northern Europe. She would become the most powerful woman in 16th-century France, arguably the most powerful woman in Europe for long stretches of the 1560s and 1570s, and she would do it while being dismissed, mocked, humiliated, and, with extraordinary consistency across 5 decades of court records, ambassadorial dispatches, and private correspondence, described as possessing breath so catastrophically foul that proximity to her was considered a trial of diplomatic endurance. That detail, the smell, is not trivial gossip. It threads through her entire story in ways that illuminate the larger cruelties of her life. A woman who was never quite wanted, never quite accepted, carrying literally on her body the evidence of her foreignness, her difference, her physical inadequacy in a court that worshipped elegance and surface. The breath was real, almost certainly, rooted in genuine medical causes. But what people made of it, the whispers, the held noses, the symbolic weight the court loaded onto a simple biological fact, tells us everything about what Catherine de' Medici was up against from the moment she set foot in France. A Medici orphan. The early years. Catherine was born on April 13, 1519, in Florence, into the most powerful banking dynasty in Europe. The Medici name meant money on a scale that was almost metaphysical. They had financed wars, propped up popes, and made themselves synonymous with the Renaissance patronage of art and architecture that was transforming the visual culture of the Western world. By birth, Catherine was one of the most advantageously positioned young women in Christendom. By circumstance, she was one of its most pitiable. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French noblewoman of genuine distinction, died of puerperal fever within days of Catherine's birth. Her father, Lorenzo II de' Medici, the man to whom Machiavelli dedicated The Prince, followed her to the grave less than a month later, almost certainly killed by a combination of tuberculosis and the syphilis he had been carrying for years. Catherine was an orphan before she was old enough to form a memory of either parent. She was raised by aunts, by nuns, by a succession of guardians whose interest in her welfare fluctuated with the political winds. She learned early, and with uncommon thoroughness, that she had no one to rely upon but herself. Her childhood was not merely sad, it was repeatedly dangerous. Florence in the late 1520s was a city under siege, literally. The Medici were expelled, returned, expelled again, and the young Catherine was twice taken as a political hostage by forces who wanted leverage over her family's supporters. On one occasion, when she was approximately 9 years old, there were serious proposals among her captors to place her in a brothel, not from cruelty per se, but from cold political calculation. A Medici daughter who had been publicly ruined could not be used as a diplomatic marriage piece. She could be neutralized cheaply and efficiently by the destruction of her reputation. The proposal was discussed. It was not implemented, but it was discussed, and the young girl living inside the besieged convent walls knew perfectly well what was being proposed for her future. She learned to watch. She learned to listen. She learned to make herself useful and agreeable to people who held power over her life, because the alternative was to be sacrificed to someone else's agenda. These are not small lessons, and Catherine never forgot them. They shaped every political instinct she possessed for the rest of her life: the preference for maneuvering over confrontation, the instinct to conceal her true feelings behind a pleasant, accommodating surface, the deep conviction that patience was not merely a virtue but a survival strategy. In 1533, when Catherine was 14, her uncle, Pope Clement VII, arranged her marriage to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. It was, on paper, an extraordinary match. In practice, it was the beginning of a long humiliation. The merchant's daughter at the court of France. The French court received Catherine de Medici with the particular coldness that the French reserve for those they consider beneath them. She was called, within earshot and without meaningful embarrassment, a merchant's daughter. Never mind that the Medici banks had financed half the thrones of Europe, and that the wealth she brought with her exceeded the annual revenue of several minor kingdoms. In the aristocratic calculus of the Valois court, she was trade, she was commerce. She was not, in the most fundamental sense, one of them. Francis I, her father-in-law, was too sophisticated and too genuinely curious about Italian culture to treat her with outright contempt. He liked her well enough, found her intelligent and entertaining, and is said to have appreciated her conversations. But even he, in an unguarded moment recorded by a court observer, reportedly remarked that she had brought him nothing but her eyes. The remark may be apocryphal. It may not be. Either way, it captured the court's sentiment with uncomfortable precision. And then there was the smell. The accounts begin early and never really stop. Courtiers noticed it. Ambassadors noted it in dispatches home, carefully worded but unmistakable in meaning. Ladies-in-waiting learned to position themselves at a slight distance during intimate conversations, and to breathe, when possible, through their mouths while maintaining expressions of engaged attentiveness. The Venetian ambassador, a man whose entire professional existence was built on the art of the diplomatic understatement, described private audiences with Catherine in terms that made clear he found them physically taxing in ways that had nothing to do with the complexity of the political discussions. The descriptions that have survived are consistent in their imagery: rotting meat, something organic and decaying, the inside of a crypt. In a court culture that was already attuned to smell in ways that modern people find strange, perfume culture was enormously sophisticated precisely because the general ambient smell of any large gathering was challenging. Catherine's breath stood out as something genuinely remarkable. And in an era when miasma theory held that bad smells literally caused disease, when the stench of something putrid was understood not merely as unpleasant, but as actively dangerous to health, there was a dimension to the problem that went beyond social discomfort. The Queen smelled like death. To a court already primed toward superstition, already watching this foreign woman with suspicion, the fact felt significant. It felt like a sign. People noted it, and remembered it, and repeated it in correspondence. And across the decades it accumulated into something larger than a simple medical condition. It became part of her mythology, woven into the image of the dark Italian queen who had brought corruption and poison into the fragrant gardens of France. What caused it? Medical historians examining the records have proposed several explanations, and the honest answer is almost certainly that multiple factors overlapped. Catherine was, by every account, an extraordinary eater. She was famous at court for the quantity and enthusiasm of her consumption at banquets, with a particular passion for artichoke hearts and cockscombs, rooster combs, considered a considerable delicacy, consumed in quantities that regularly left her prostrate with digestive distress. Contemporary accounts describe her being so ill after particularly indulgent meals that she had to be assisted from the table. Chronic, severe gastrointestinal problems would have contributed substantially to the smell. Beyond the eating, dental hygiene in 16th century France was exactly what one would expect. That is to say, catastrophic by modern standards. Even wealthy, powerful individuals in this period suffered from tooth decay and gum disease as a matter of course, because the tools for prevention and treatment were simply not available. Catherine's specific dental history is not preserved in detail, but there is every reason to believe she suffered the same chronic oral deterioration that affected virtually everyone around her. And there are hints in medical records of the period that suggest some kind of persistent gum condition. Taken together, chronic digestive disorder, severe gum disease, possible halitosis with an underlying medical cause such as postnasal drip or a chronic sinus condition. The picture is of a woman whose body betrayed her social ambitions in ways she could not control and could not hide. She could dress magnificently. She did. She could cultivate an air of gracious authority. She achieved it. But she could not, with 16th century medicine and cosmetic technology, do anything substantive about a problem rooted in her physiology. She lived with it. The court lived with it. And the court, being the court, never let anyone forget. 10 years. No children. The decade of humiliation. If the breath was one form of social torment, the barrenness was another, and for the first decade of her marriage, Catherine endured both simultaneously. Henry, her husband, had been in love with his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, since before his marriage to Catherine, and made absolutely no effort to conceal it. Diane was 20 years older than Henry, and she possessed a kind of effortless, luminous elegance, a cool, classical beauty that made her the aesthetic ideal of the court, the woman painters and sculptors competed to depict, the woman against whom every other woman at court was unconsciously measured. Against that standard, Catherine, round, dark-eyed, Italian, smelling of something unnameable, had no chance whatsoever. Diane ran the household. Diane influenced policy and patronage. Diane wore jewels that were by rights the Queen's jewels. Henry corresponded with Diane in terms of passionate devotion, and with Catherine in terms of polite but obvious obligation. Catherine watched all of this from a position of helplessness that would have destroyed a less resilient person, and produced no children, which made everything worse. 10 years of whispered campaigns to have the marriage annulled. 10 years of Francis I, who did in his fashion, like her, being quietly pressed by court factions to reconsider the arrangement, to send the barren Italian back to Florence and make a more strategically useful match for his son. 10 years of being the woman nobody wanted nearby, in every sense. Catherine, by various accounts, sought help everywhere. She consulted physicians. She consulted astrologers. She is reported to have drunk mare's urine and used preparations of hare's dung and other remedies that the period's medical tradition recommended for infertility. With the earnest desperation of a woman who understood that her continued presence at the French court depended entirely on her ability to produce an heir. She also reportedly consulted a physician who provided her husband with specific guidance on positioning and technique, a detail that later court memoirs recorded with varying degrees of delicacy, and which suggests that the fertility problem may have been, in part, anatomical in a way that surgery or at least altered practice could address. And then, improbably, comprehensively, it worked. Beginning in 1543, Catherine began producing children with a regularity that almost seemed to be making up for lost time. 10 children in 12 years. 7 of them survived infancy, already a better rate than the period's tragic average. 3 of them would be kings of France: Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. 1, Elizabeth, would become Queen of Spain. Another, Marguerite, would become Queen of Navarre and later Queen of France itself, and would write memoirs that remain among the most vivid documents of the 16th century. Catherine had, through sheer biological determination, and what may have been a constitutionally remarkable resilience, transformed herself from a woman the court wanted to discard into the mother of the French royal succession. She had made herself, at last, indispensable. She filed the knowledge away. The lance through the eye. Everything changes. Henry II died on July 10, 1559, in a way that felt almost grotesquely theatrical, which is to say, in a jousting accident, in the middle of a festival designed to celebrate the peace treaties he had just concluded. A tournament lance struck him above the right eye during a celebratory joust, splintered, drove wooden fragments into his brain. He lingered for 11 days in extraordinary agony, while the best physicians in Europe, including the great Andreas Vesalius, summoned urgently from Brussels, tried everything they knew, which was not sufficient, and Catherine sat by his bedside through all of it. He died without recovering consciousness in any meaningful sense, without giving her a final word, without any of the closure that grief sometimes provides. Catherine dressed herself in black and did not remove it for the remaining 30 years of her life. The black dress became her signature, her armor, her statement. The woman who had been invisible in the brightly colored court of the Valois became, in mourning, impossible to overlook. The Black Queen, La Reine Noire, was born from the same moment that the court expected her, finally, to step aside. She did not step aside. Her son Francis II, aged 15 and in poor health, became king. Francis was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, a young woman of spectacular beauty and considerable political intelligence, whose Guise uncles rapidly moved to seize control of the government. Catherine, who had spent decades learning patience at the French court, watched the Guise faction attempt to marginalize her just as every faction had marginalized her before. She responded with the political intelligence she had been quietly assembling for 25 years. She maneuvered, negotiated, played factions against each other, and when Francis II died in December 1560, just 17 months into his reign, killed by an ear infection that spread to his brain, she was positioned. Her second son, Charles IX, was 10 years old. Catherine became regent. The woman no one had wanted nearby was now the most powerful person in France. The regent's art, managing the unmanageable. What Catherine de Medici faced as regent of France was not merely a political challenge. It was something closer to a civilization in the process of tearing itself apart. The wars of religion, the long, catastrophic series of conflicts between French Catholics and Protestants known as Huma that would consume France for the better part of 4 decades were already beginning to take shape when she assumed power. The Edict of January 1562, which she supported, and which represented one of the first serious attempts in European history to grant legal toleration to a religious minority, was her opening bid, a genuine attempt to find a settlement that both sides could live with. Both sides rejected it with enthusiasm. Catherine has been mischaracterized in popular history as a fanatic Catholic, a label that Protestant propagandists attached to her early and thoroughly, and which stuck with a tenacity that the historical record does not support. She was, by the standards of her time, remarkably indifferent to the specific theological questions that were setting the continent on fire. She did not much care whether the Eucharist was literally or figuratively the body of Christ. She did not have strong views on justification by faith or works. What she cared about was France, and the French crown, and the survival of the Valois dynasty. And she understood, with a clarity that eluded the true believers on both sides, that a France consumed by religious civil war was a France that could not be governed, defended, or inherited. Her problem was that this pragmatic position pleased nobody. To Catholics, a queen who was willing to negotiate with heretics was suspect, possibly heretical herself, certainly dangerously naive. To Protestants, Any concession made by a Valois queen was a trap, and events would eventually give them excellent reason to hold that view. Catherine spent the 1560s in a kind of perpetual diplomatic motion, arranging meetings, proposing compromises, attempting to manage the energies of men who were entirely uninterested in being managed. She rode on horseback through military camps. She conducted negotiations in person with Huguenot leaders, traveling to meet them rather than requiring them to come to court. She wrote thousands of letters in her characteristic crabbed hand, adjusting tone and argument to each recipient, trying always to find the angle that would allow one more agreement, one more breathing space, one more year of relative peace. It was, in many ways, magnificent political work. It was also almost entirely futile, because the forces she was trying to manage had their own internal logic and their own momentum, and no amount of Florentine cleverness could substitute for the absence of any genuine will to coexist. The perfumer's daughter and the poison myth, alongside the smell and the barrenness and the foreignness, the legend that accumulated most persistently around Catherine de' Medici was the poison myth. She was said to keep a cabinet of poisons, a cabinet des poisons, and to have used it with systematic efficiency against her enemies. Ren the Florentine, her personal perfumer, featured in Protestant pamphlets as a kind of sinister alchemist who provided her with toxic gloves, poisoned books, and lethal cosmetics. Various deaths at the French court, several of them genuinely suspicious, several of them probably just the consequence of living in the 16th century, where death was casual and frequent, were attributed to her hand. The historical consensus among serious scholars is that the poison cabinet is largely mythological, a projection of Protestant fears onto a foreign Catholic queen who had been cast as a villain before she had fully taken the stage. There is no credible direct evidence that Catherine poisoned anyone. This does not mean she was innocent of all moral responsibility for the deaths that occurred around her, or that she was above ordering actions she knew to be lethal. She almost certainly authorized some political killings. But the elaborate apparatus of systematic poisoning that the legend describes, the gloves, the apples, the slow-acting compounds administered at banquets, belongs to the genre of propaganda, not history. The myth was nonetheless enormously consequential, because it shaped how contemporaries and subsequent generations understood everything Catherine did. Every death in proximity to her became evidence. Every political calculation she made was reinterpreted through the lens of the poisoner. The smell, that persistent, biological, uncontrollable smell, fed neatly into the narrative. A woman who reeked of something corrupt, something rotten, something that suggested the chemistry of decay. Was it not natural to assume that she worked in poisons? Was it not almost obvious? This is the peculiar cruelty of stigma. A medical condition becomes a metaphor becomes a narrative becomes received truth. Catherine de' Medici spent her life fighting this process, unable to separate herself from the image the court and her enemies had constructed from the raw material of her body and her foreignness. St. Bartholomew's Day, the weight that cannot be set down. No account of Catherine de' Medici can avoid the night of August 23, 24, 1572, and no account of that night should try to diminish what happened. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre stands as one of the most horrific events of 16th century Europe, the systematic killing of Huguenot nobles gathered in Paris for a wedding Catherine had herself arranged, followed by days of mob violence that spread from Paris through the provinces and killed thousands of Protestant civilians. Catherine had arranged the wedding between her daughter Marguerite and Henry of Navarre, the Bourbon Protestant heir, as a peace initiative, one more attempt at the reconciliation strategy she had been pursuing for a decade. The marriage was intended to bring the Huguenot leadership to Paris and bind the factions together through dynastic connection. It brought them to Paris, and it concentrated them there, and then everything went catastrophically wrong. In the days before the massacre, an assassination attempt was made on Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most important Huguenot military leader, who was staying in Paris for the wedding. The attempt failed. Coligny was wounded, but not killed. The Huguenot nobles in the city, enraged, demanded justice. Catherine faced a court in crisis. Protestant leaders calling for retribution. Catholic hardliners warning that the Huguenots would take revenge. And the terrifying possibility that the failed assassination, whose precise origins remain disputed by historians, would reignite full-scale civil war. What followed in the next hours and days represents the most damning decision of Catherine's life. The weight of historical evidence suggests that she approved, in the early hours of August 24, a targeted elimination of Huguenot military leadership, perhaps a dozen men, the core of the Protestant command structure. Whether she understood or anticipated that this targeted order would be interpreted as general permission for massacre is genuinely contested. What is not contested is the result. The Catholic Parisian mob, inflamed by years of religious hatred, received the killing of Huguenot nobles as a signal that the season was open. And the slaughter that followed was not targeted, not controlled, and not surgical. It was butchery. Thousands died. Bodies were thrown from windows, dragged through streets, thrown into the Seine. Contemporary accounts, including some sympathetic to Catherine, place her at a palace window watching the violence unfold in the streets below. Whether the expression on her face was satisfaction, horror, or the blank pragmatic stillness of a woman who had just crossed a line she could not uncross is not recorded. Perhaps she did not know herself. The moral weight of that window cannot be distributed away. Catherine de Medici, whatever the precise nature of the order she gave, and whatever she intended, set in motion a massacre. The fact that she had spent 10 years trying to prevent exactly this kind of religious violence, the fact that the massacre was in some sense the catastrophic failure of her entire political project rather than its culmination, the fact that she was operating under genuine pressure and genuine fear, all of this contextualizes her decision without excusing it. She bears responsibility. History has assigned it, and history is not wrong. The architecture of her legacy. Away from the blood, Catherine de Medici was one of the great cultural patrons of the French Renaissance, and this aspect of her legacy has been persistently undervalued. She introduced the fork to France, Italian dining culture, which had developed the practice of individual utensils before the French court caught up, arrived in her luggage, and stayed. She brought the Florentine technique of perfumery that transformed French fragrance culture, with a certain dark irony given the olfactory difficulties she herself presented. She introduced the high-heeled shoe to France, having arrived wearing the elevated shoes fashionable in Florence, and inspiring a court fashion that never entirely went away. She patronized Ronsard and the poets of the Pléiade, the literary movement that was in the process of transforming French as a literary language. She commissioned architecture of lasting magnificence. The Tuileries Palace, designed to her specifications, stood for 3 centuries before being burned in the Paris Commune of 1871. She brought Italian theatrical and musical traditions to France that evolved into what we now recognize as ballet, making her one of the founding patrons of an art form that France made entirely its own. She was also, in the privacy of her correspondence, a devoted and genuinely anguished mother who watched her children sicken, suffer politically, and die with a grief that her public composure could not entirely conceal. Her letters to her children mixed the brisk, pragmatic calculation of the politician with sudden, unguarded notes of raw maternal love that are deeply human in their texture. She could not separate her political identity from her maternal one. She was always managing both simultaneously. But the love was real, whatever its entanglement with ambition. The last years, watching it crumble. Catherine spent the 1580s watching the edifice she had spent her life constructing begin to come apart. Her son Henry III, the last of her sons to rule, was a king of genuine intelligence but catastrophic political instincts, whose reign became consumed by the rise of the Catholic League, a faction so extreme in its religious politics that it made Catherine's old Catholic opponents look moderate by comparison. The League was backed by Spanish gold and animated by a religious fanaticism that had no patience for Catherine's perpetual compromises and negotiations. She was, in these last years, largely sidelined. Her counsel was sought less frequently. Her letters went unanswered or received dilatory replies. The influence she had built so laboriously over decades was eroding as the political landscape rearranged itself around dynamics she could no longer control. Her health was failing. She suffered from the accumulated consequences of 60 years of extreme eating, the stress of perpetual political crisis, and the physical decline of a woman in her late 60s, in a century where 69 was genuinely old. She died on January 5, 1589, at the Château de Blois, with her son Henry III at her side. The cause was pleurisy, an inflammation of the lining of the lungs, and she had been ill for several weeks before the end. The court she had spent her life navigating had effectively moved on without her. The dynasty she had dedicated everything to preserving had 7 months left. Henry III was assassinated by a fanatical monk named Jacques Clement on August 1, 1589, dying of his wounds the following day. He was the last Valois king. The dynasty ended with him. The Bourbon line, descended from the Protestant Henry of Navarre, the man Catherine had brought to Paris for that catastrophic wedding, took the throne as Henry IV and, with characteristic pragmatic intelligence, converted to Catholicism in 1593 with the remark, possibly apocryphal but perfectly characteristic, that Paris was worth a mass. Catherine had wanted to preserve the Valois. She had sacrificed, maneuvered, compromised, and arguably killed for it. It collapsed anyway within months of her death, and the man who replaced it was a Protestant she had once hoped to neutralize through marriage. There is a tendency, in retrospect, to resolve figures like Catherine de Medici into one thing: monster, or victim, or misunderstood genius. All three readings exist in the literature. All three are incomplete. She was a woman born into extraordinary privilege and immediately stripped of every protection that privilege might have provided. She was a foreigner in a court that valued exclusion as a social sport. She was the butt of jokes about her appearance, her accent, her smell, her origins, for decades before anyone took her seriously as a political actor. She survived all of it through intelligence, patience, and a refusal to be destroyed that borders on the superhuman. She was also capable of catastrophic moral failure. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre happened because of decisions she made, and no amount of contextualizing those decisions should be allowed to dissolve her responsibility for them. She operated in a violent world, and she was not above using violence when she calculated that it served her purposes. She was wrong about what it would produce. She was a Renaissance woman in the most complete sense, shaped by the Florentine tradition that saw politics as an art, that believed a sufficiently clever person could manage any situation through maneuvering and calculation, that was deeply skeptical of ideological absolutes and deeply committed to the pragmatic possible. France in the 16th century was not a place where that tradition worked particularly well. The religious wars had their own terrible internal logic, and no amount of Florentine cleverness could substitute for the genuine will to coexist that neither side possessed. The smell stays with her in history because it is so human, so uncontrollable, so much the opposite of the image of omnipotent manipulation that her enemies constructed. The poisoner, the schemer, the Black Queen. These are images of total control, of a woman who pulls every string, who directs every event from behind a curtain of calculation. But the smell is the reminder that she was also a person who ate too much at banquets, who had troubled teeth, who could not command her own body to behave in ways that served her social ambitions. She was, beneath the black dress and the Medici jewels and the 1,000 political calculations, a human being in a body that embarrassed her, trying to hold together a world that was determined to fall apart. She almost managed it.